I'm actually going to talk about music, meaning and morality and address a question which was first really posed properly by Plato when he wrote in the Republic that the ways of poetry and music are not changed anywhere without change in the most important laws of the city. Plato is famous for having given what is perhaps the first theory of character in music, proposing to allow some modes and to forbid others according to the character which can be heard in them. However we fill out the details of this theory, there is no doubt that music for Plato was something that could be judged in the same moral terms that we judge one another, and that the terms in question denoted virtues and vices, like nobility, dignity, temperance, and chastity on the one hand, and sensuality, belligerence, and indiscipline on the other. The targets of Plato's argument were not individual works of music or specific performances, but modes. We don't exactly know how the Greek modes were arranged. They conventionally identified styles, instruments, and melodic and rhythmical devices, as well as the notes of the scale. But without going into the matter, we can suggest that Plato was discriminating between recognizable musical idioms, as we might discriminate jazz from rock and both from classical. And his concern was not so very different from that of a modern person. You're the man I need. This is not up there on the screen. And I haven't got any speakers for that. Thank you. The next one. There you go. No, I won't look quite so incompetent. Right. So can we go on to the next slide? There we go. I won't refer to all the things that are on the slides, but nevertheless, I've said most of what's on this slide already. That for hang on, there we are. For Plato, okay, one click around. Music is essentially involved in the education, the moral education of young people. And the Greek modes were his way of describing the differences between the kinds of music that he liked or recommended and that which he didn't. And his concern was not so very different from that of a modern person worrying about the moral character and moral effect of death metal, say, or musical kitsch of the Andrew Lloyd Webber variety. Should our children be listening to this stuff, is the question in the mind of modern adults, just as should the city permit this stuff was the question in the mind of Plato. Now, we've long since given up on the idea that you can forbid certain kinds of music by law. However, we should remember that this idea has had a long history and has been a decisive factor in the evolution of the Christian churches, which have been as censorious over music as over words, and indeed have hardly made the distinction between them. Moreover, it's still common to believe that styles of music and individual works of music have or can have a moral character, and that the character of a work or style of music can rub off in some way on its devotees. It makes perfectly good sense and is often profoundly illuminating to describe individual works and also styles and idioms in terms of the virtues and vices of people. The first movement of Elgar's Second Symphony, which is marked nobilmente in the score, is undeniably noble. And if the nobility is in a measure flawed, this too is part of its moral character. Let's see if I can go. No. We know of music that is good-humoured, lascivious, gentle, bold, chaste, self-indulgent, sentimental, reserved, and generous. And all those words describe moral virtues and vices which we are as little surprised to find in music as in human beings. Our ways of describing music give incontrovertible proof that we find moral significance in music. And it would be surprising if this were so, and we did not also believe that people should be encouraged to listen to some things and discouraged from listening to others. For our characters are shaped by the company we keep, and those who rejoice in the company of crooks and creeps are likely to become crooks or creeps themselves. It is difficult, therefore, to disagree with Plato's view that music has a central role in education and that musical education can go badly wrong. And even if we don't forbid musical idioms by law, we should remember that our laws are made by people who have musical tastes, or at least used to have musical tastes. And Plato may be right, even in relation to a modern democracy, that changes in musical culture go hand in hand with changes in the laws, since changes in the laws so often reflect pressures from the culture. There is no doubt that popular music today enjoys a status higher than any other cultural product. Pop stars are first among celebrities, idolised by the young, taken as role models, courted by politicians, and in general endowed with a magic aura that gives them power over crowds. It is surely likely, therefore, that something of their message will rub off on the laws passed by the politicians who admire them. If the message is sensual, self-centred and materialistic, then we should not expect to find that our laws address us from any higher realm than that implies. However, although we make moral judgments, we are ever more hesitant to express them. And I've got to almost the end of this slide. Ours is a non-judgmental culture, and the hostility to judgment arises from the democratic belief in human equality. To criticise another's taste, whether in music, entertainment, or lifestyle, is to assume that some tastes are superior to others. And this, for many people, is offensive. Who are you, they respond, to judge another's taste? Young people in particular feel this, and since it is young people who are the principal devotees of pop music, this places a formidable obstacle in the path of anyone who undertakes to criticise pop music in a university. This is especially so if the criticism is phrased in Plato's idiom as an analysis and condemnation of the moral vices exemplified by a musical style. In the face of this, a teacher might be tempted to give up on the question of judgment and assume that anything goes, that all tastes are equally valid, and that insofar as music is an object of academic study, it is not criticism, but technical analysis and know-how that should be imparted. Indeed, this is the line that seems to be followed in academic departments of musicology. The question of the moral character of music is also complicated by the fact that music is appreciated in many different ways. People dance to it, they work and converse over a background of music, they perform it and they listen to it. People happily dance to music that they cannot bear to listen to, which is a fairly normal experience. You can talk over Mozart, but not over Schoenberg. You can work to Chopin, but not to Wagner. And it is sometimes argued that the melodic and rhythmic contour of pop music both fits it for being overheard rather than listened to, and also encourages a need for pop in the background. Some psychologists wonder whether this need follows the pattern of addictions, and more philosophical critics, like this gentleman, Adorno, raise questions of a deep kind as to whether listening has not changed entirely with the development of the short-range melodies and clustered harmonic progressions that are typical of songs in the jazz tradition. Adorno had come as a refugee from Nazism to America, where he enjoyed the usual privileges granted by American universities to European intellectuals, and where he repaid his hosts in the usual way by writing criticisms of America that seethed with venom and contempt. His target was what he and his older colleague Max Horkheimer called mass culture, the principal manifestations of which he found in the Hollywood movie and in jazz. For Adorno, music lies at the heart of modern civilization, and the destiny of music is a kind of indicator of the moral, spiritual, and political health of a society. His adverse judgment of the culture of American capitalism was influenced by his broadly Marxist perspective on the modern world, but it focused first of all, and indeed almost to the exclusion of all other indicators, on the aesthetic tastes prevalent in America, and in particular on the music that we know now as the American songbook. The harmonic and melodic language of that book has penetrated to the very bones of our civilization. And when we listen now to a jazz standard by Cole Porter, George Gershwin or Hoagie Carmichael, we are struck most of all by the innocence of the idiom. The last time, perhaps, that old-fashioned monogamous marriage was celebrated in our music. Adorno attacked something that he called the regression of listening and the musical fetish. He believed that this had infected the entire culture of modern America. His concern was not with isolated works of music, but with an entire musical culture. He saw the culture of listening as a deep spiritual resource of Western civilization, one whose effects he laboured unsuccessfully to express. In some way, the habit of listening to long-range musical thought, in which themes are subjected to extended melodic, harmonic and rhythmic development, is connected, for Adorno, to the ability to live beyond the moment, to transcend the search for instant gratification, to set aside the routines of the consumer society with its constant pursuit of the fetish, and to put real values in the place of fleeting desires. So Adorno thought, and there is something surely deep and persuasive here, something that needs to be rescued from his intemperate and over-politicised critique of just about everything he saw from his window. In searching for Adorno's meaning, we should set aside his unnuanced and unjust criticism of jazz and of the tradition of popular song that arose from it. Instead, we should look at what is happening to our musical culture now, and in particular, we should try to figure out how we might plausibly criticise pop music in general, and particular styles and songs in particular, for the things that they are, and independently of their causes and effects. Not that we can entirely disregard the causes and effects of pop. Adorno reminds us that it is very hard to criticise a whole musical idiom without standing in judgment on the culture to which it belongs. Musical idioms don't come in sealed packets with no relation to the rest of human life. And when a particular kind of music surrounds us in public spaces, when it invades every cafe, bar and restaurant, when it glares at us from passing motor cars and dribbles from the open taps of radios all over the planet, the critic may seem to stand like the apocryphal King Canute before an irresistible tide, uttering useless and curmudgeonly cries of indignation. Do we then give up on pop music, regard it as beyond criticism, and the culture expressed in it as a fact of life? I want at least to cast some doubt on that idea. Now, I'll see if I can get this. That is called Alice Practice from an outfit called Crystal Castles. Now, surely there are relevant things to be said about this which have a bearing not only on its value as music, but also on the moral condition of those who unproblematically enjoy it. It has a million entries just for that one piece already on Google, so there's quite an audience right out there. Older people tend to react negatively, of course, to this foregrounding of an excited female voice, regarding it as pornographic, though the lyrics are not actually directly about sex. But that feature is not what is most striking to the musical ear. It is surely very noticeable that this piece has no melody, equally noticeable that it is harmonically impoverished, most noticeable of all that the sounds responsible for what there is of rhythmic impetus are made by electronic means and do not reflect the body rhythms of the person producing them. These sounds and the meter that they establish are profoundly alien to the natural rhythms of the human body or to the expectations of the human ear. We are dealing with a kind of machine-made music which has been detached from the traditional source of music in human life and in the impulse to dance and sing in company. The voice is suspended on electric wires like the corpse of a galvanized frog. Someone might reply that the quality of a piece of music lies in what it provokes in the listener. Alice, let's call her that, aims to excite powerful emotions and succeeds in doing so. In this sense, the music is successful. Maybe if Crystal Castles had used the old techniques of melodic, harmonic and rhythmical order, they would have produced something banal and uninteresting. So why not praise them for achieving the only thing that they set out to achieve, which is to awaken the sleeping giants of lust and rage? Now, it is important to recognise that there are two ways in which a response can be provoked by music. either by triggering it, as laughter is triggered by tickling, or by providing a proper object of it, so as to inspire a reflective form of sympathy. I've got a little bit into this now. Mood-changing drugs have strong psychic effects, both pleasant and unpleasant, but they work in another way from art and music. They do not address our powers of understanding and rational reflection, and are dangerous for that very reason, in that they set up addictive pathways which bypass critical reflection. If that is how Crystal Castles aim to work, then why do we not regard their music as we regard mood-changing drugs, as something which ought to be subject to legislative control, exactly as Plato recommended? That's a piece of music that induces an effect which has nothing to do with its quality as music, and which indeed bypasses every form of musical understanding. It works like tickling, an infectious laughter without an object, laughter without amusement, comparable to the hurt without a cause that is invoked by Alice. Needless to say, the laughter provoked by the laughing policeman is quite unlike the laughter provoked by Mozart's wonderful music at the end of the second act of The Marriage of Figaro, in which the harmonic progressions take up the situation of the protagonists and gradually topple everything in Figaro's favour. Mozart's music makes you laugh by virtue of its intrinsic quality as music. You won't get it if you don't respond to the musical joke, which arises within the melodic, harmonic and rhythmical order that you hear. In responding to the Mozart, you are laughing at and also with the music. In listening to the laughing policeman, you are laughing at nothing, just as when someone is tickling you. And you are not laughing with the music either, since it is not the music that is laughing. Now, I have suggested that there are three elements of musical organisation, in all three of which Alice's practice is defective. But I want now to say more about each of them, since this will give us some purchase on the realm of pop. We're often told that rhythm is of prime importance in pop, that it is music to be danced to, after all, and that those who judge it by the standards of the concert hall, which is a place of silent listening, have simply lost the plot. And this is certainly this is certainly a fair response to the more curmudgeonly forms of criticism, but it raises a question of profound importance in the study of music, which is that of the nature of rhythm. The first thing you hear in the example from Alice is a painful slicing of time by an electric cheese wire. And this reminds you, or ought to remind you, that rhythm is not the same thing as measure. It is not just a matter of dividing time into repeatable units. It is a matter of organising it into a form of movement, so that one note invites the next into the space that it has vacated. This is exactly what goes on in dancing, in real dancing, I mean. And the complaints that might be made against the worst forms of pop apply also to the lame attempts at dancing that generally are produced by it. Attempts which involve no control of the body, no attempt to dance with another person, but at best only the attempt to dance at him or her, by making movements that are sliced up and atomized like the sounds that set Alice in motion. And if you want to see an example of this kind of dancing, you look at the video of Alice practice on YouTube. I want to contrast Alice with an example of real rhythm from an early pop song. I'll take one that's known to all of you. I have to turn this over. Has he gone? Right. That's Elvis in Heartbreak Hotel. Now you notice with that example that the rhythm is generated internally by the melodic line. And this is generated by the voice alone. You've got the rhythm before the backing comes in, and there's none of that drum kit to obscure it. And when the backing joins in, it does so not by measuring out the bar lines and slicing up the time sequence, but by taking up the pulse of Elvis's voice. Measure here is not imposed upon the melodic line like a grid, but precipitated out from it, making virtual bar lines in the ear as we respond to the syncopation of the voice. No violent drumming, no amplified bass, none of the devices which I am tempted to say are a substitute for rhythm in so much contemporary pop. I'll give you another example of the phenomenon I have in mind. this is one I haven't got, so it doesn't matter. It only makes the same point. It being yes. So take it as read. Lay Down Sally by Eric Clapton. But I will want to contrast it with another example. Have we got the speakers? Yeah. If you couldn't stand any longer. Pity we've missed out the vocals. That is Bleed from the Swedish death metal group called Meshuggah. Meshuggah is German slang for confused, and you should be Meshuggah. Metal, of course, is an idiom all to itself, which is by no means typical of the pop scene. There's much to admire in the virtuosity of the drummer in that example. There's nothing like it in all of music, I think. Though whether you could say he has got rhythm in the manner of Elvis, I doubt. Until organised melodically, rhythm tends to reduce to measures, whereas when organised melodically, it is raised to the level of gesture and movement. And the difference here is not material, it is phenomenological. Difference in the way repetitions are heard. In the one way they are heard as regular beats like the pulse of a machine, in the other case they are heard as repeated movements of the kind that our bodies produce when running, walking or dancing. And a simple way to appreciate this point is to listen to an eighth-some reel. So here you are, just to give you an example of real dance music. Nothing could be more metrically regular than that, but there is an audible sense of transition between sections as the gestures change. Hands in the air all round the middle of the body, legs freely crossing or inclined to stamp. And the melody is slightly varied with each change of partner, and the excitement builds with every closure of the melodic line. Now, the contrast with Bleed is fairly obvious, but the phenomenology of this goes a little deeper than that implies. The rhythm in the Meshuggah piece is shot at you. The rhythm in the reel invites you to move with it. And the difference between at and with is one of the deepest differences we know, and it's the real theme of this talk. It is exemplified in all our encounters with other people, notably in conversation and in sexual gambits. And the withness of the eighth-some reel reflects the fact that this is a social dance in which people move consciously with others and without being motivated by any sexual interest, necessarily. The human need for this kind of dancing is still with us and explains the current craze for salsa, as well as the periodic revivals of ballroom dancing and Scottish reels. And the withness of the reel was noticed and commented upon very early in the history of modern aesthetics by Schiller, who regarded what he called English dancing as confirming the connection between beauty and gentility. And here are his words. The first law of gentility is have consideration for the freedom of others. The second, show your freedom. The correct fulfillment of both is an infinitely difficult problem, but gentility always requires it relentlessly, and it alone makes the cosmopolitan person. I know of no more fitting image of the ideal of beautiful relations than the well-danced and multiply convoluted English dance. The spectator in the gallery, see where he was coming from, sees countless movements which cross each other colourfully and change their direction willfully but never collide. Everything has been arranged so that the first has already made room for the second before he arrives. Everything comes together so skillfully and yet so artlessly that both seem merely to be following their own mind while never impeding the other. This is the most fitting picture of a maintained personal freedom which respects the freedom of others. Now, it's a beautiful passage there, profoundly influenced by Kant's theory of the moral law, but nevertheless a true description of what goes on when a Scottish reel is properly danced. Now, metal is shouted at its devotees, and the loss of melody from the vocal line emphasises this. Not that melody is entirely absent, of course, it is allowed in with the guitar solo, which is often a poignant reflection on its own loneliness. The world of this music is one in which people talk, shout, dance, and feel at each other, without ever doing those things with them. You dance to heavy metal by headbanging, slam dancing, or mashing, which means pushing people around in the crowd. Such dancing is not really open to people of all ages, but confined confined to the young and the sexually available. Of course, there is nothing to forbid the old and shriveled from joining in. But the sight of their doing so is an embarrassment all the greater when they themselves seem unaware of this. Now that is not yet a criticism, but it is moving us towards the recognition of what seems to me to be an important truth about pop music, which is that what seems like rhythm and the foregrounding of rhythm is often, in fact, an absence of rhythm, a drowning out of rhythm by the beat. Rhythm divorced from melodic organisation becomes inert. It loses its quality as gesture and hence loses the plasticity of human gestures. As an extreme contrast, which I hope nevertheless will drive the point home, you all know that, I hope. So there you have an example of a beautiful little rhythmic cell, which Dvorak builds into a magnificent contrapuntal organisation, keeping the rhythm intact but overlaying it on itself. It's only because of the melodic and harmonic meaning of that little cell that you can actually hear the rhythm as the organising principle of the scherzo of the New World Symphony. So thanks to the melodic order, this cell can be used as a building block, added, divided, multiplied in counterpoint to generate a rhythmical excitement, which in my view has no real equivalent in modern pop. Now, that example comes from the concert hall, from music to be listened to, in which rhythm has been emancipated from the demands of the dance floor and incorporated into complex contrapuntal reasoning. Nevertheless, it is still rhythm generated within the music and setting it in a motion of its own. Now, I think this is a good place to make a few philosophical points. And this is where it might become a little bit more difficult. When we hear a piece of music, we hear a sequence of sounds, one sound and then another. Usually these sounds are pitched, and melody depends upon playing different pitches in succession. When we hear a melody, however, we don't just hear a succession of pitched sounds. We hear something else, namely a movement between those sounds. The melody begins on one note, continues through its successors in a goal-directed way, and ends on another note. And this is something that we hear, even though nothing in the physical world actually moves. Those sounds are in a place, they don't move from place to place, and no note in music can move from C to E or whatever without becoming a different note. So there isn't actual movement in the melodic line, but we hear it as moving. And the movement in music can go on even when no sound is heard. Here's a very well-known example from Beethoven. You know that? Sorry. The first four notes of that melody from the last wind of the Third Symphony are staccato and interrupted by very long silences during which the music is still moving. The melody is still moving on its way from E flat to B flat and back to bottom E flat to E flat again. So this is an extraordinary fact, that melodic movement can be heard even in silence. And of course, as the symphonic tradition developed in the 19th century, composers made great use of this. Silences in Mahler are absolutely overfull in my view of life. Sounds exist in the physical world. They are real objects, admittedly of a distinctive kind, but as real as colours and rainbows. Sounds are studied by physics. They obey the laws of motion that govern all other entities in space and time. Animals hear them. They also discriminate sounds on the basis of their pitches. But they don't hear melodies. And birds, for instance, who create sequences that we hear as music, do not, in my view, hear them as music. For this kind of hearing involves imaginative capacities that no bird has. And this movement is in part a causal idea. To hear the melody move from C to E flat, say, is to hear the E flat as called into being by the C. There's a virtual force that operates between the notes and drives them on towards closure. Here is a simple example from Beethoven's Third Piano Concerto. You feel the force pushing it up the C minor triad and then coming down again by scale steps to C. but you know that that force is still there. It hasn't been complete. It hasn't been concluded. So Beethoven has to add, right, to try and stop the force from leaking out at the bottom of the theme. And that's something that we hear. If we didn't hear that kind of thing, we wouldn't understand music. And that particular example of Beethoven's Third Piano Concerto is a wonderful instance of precisely with something constructed out of very simple units, all of which have this force driving them on to join with the next movement, the next element. Now, likewise, sounds made at one end of the. I take the example of Adorno's Piano Concerto, but I find it's not on my computer. But the opening of Brahms' Second Piano Concerto is another very good instance where, if you remember, there's a horn call. Sorry. Which calls the piano up from the depths to answer it with the same pattern. And yet the piano, of course, is 200 metres away, the other end of the concert hall. Yet nevertheless, the force passes effortlessly from the last note of the horn to the first of the piano. Very simple instances those, but nevertheless I think worth thinking about. Because we should bear in mind that we don't make music merely by producing sounds. And there is indeed a danger inherent in the very art of music that it might at any moment collapse into sound, to become a sound effect whose purpose is to produce responses in something like the way that the laughing policeman produces laughter, without drawing our attention to what can be heard in and imagined in the rhythmic and melodic line. The collapse of music into sound is in fact happening all around us, both in the world of pop and in the concert hall. And I'm making a case for condemning it, since the sound effect is not a new kind of music, but a loss of music. And that brings me to melody. Defining melody is one of the unfinished tasks of musical aesthetics, and I can here only give a few hints. It is a good starting point to remark that a melody has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But unfortunately that is not always true. A melody that begins with an upbeat, like so many folk songs, that first note, does that first note belong to the melody, or is it just preparing the way for it? There's no answer. The beginning is, as it were, hidden behind those two notes. So where the melody begins is not clear. You can hear the upbeat as inside or outside the melody, but the boundary somehow disappears behind it. Many melodies tail off without a clear conclusion. I've got an example here which might as well play it. So melodies don't have to have a beginning, they don't have to have an end. And to say that all melodies must have a middle is to say nothing at all. But traditionally, melody has been the fundamental principle of the popular song. It is what makes it possible to memorize the words and to join in the singing. All folk traditions contain a repertoire of melodies which often are built from repeatable elements, but which also show remarkable elaborations, as in the seemingly endless melodies of the Indian raga or the Gregorian chant. The American songbook exhibits a new kind of melody shaped by jazz rhythms and harmonies, and many of its tunes have endured to become known all over the world. By contrast, there is very little emerging from pop that shows either melodic invention or even an awareness of why melody matters. That is to say, an awareness of its social meaning and its ability to give musical substance to a strophic song. Countless pop songs give us permutations of the same stock phrases, diatonic or pentatonic, but kept together not by any intrinsic power of adhesion, but only by a plodding rhythmical backing and banal sequence of chords. Right, so there's no point in copyrighting that tune. There's no point in suing for breach of copyright either. More frequent still and more interesting is the melody on one note. And I'm going to have to. This is from the Kooks, Ula. Right, it goes on like that. By repeating a single note, they elide the melodic line into the rhythm, not without skill, I would say, and that's certainly a lot more rhythmical than some of the things than Ozzy Osbourne. But the rhythm is itself reduced to a regular pulse that has little or no independent musical force. And I think you should look out for this device, since it occurs countless times in contemporary pop, and is probably part of what prevents them from suing each other under copyright. So by these devices, stock phrases and repeated notes, a pop musician can avoid the real challenge of melody making, which is to produce the virtual movement that will propel the melody onwards, whether or not to its conclusion. Now, melodies, of course, are of many kinds, and we shouldn't criticise pop just because it doesn't obey the rules of a tradition to which it doesn't belong. And indeed, what we now know as tunes are a latecomer to the melodic repertoire. And I'll give you an example of Baroque. And that's obviously Adorno from the St. Matthew Passion. Lasts a whole minute. You wouldn't call it a tune. All the boundaries are all internal, they're all weak. The melody can be subdivided in countless ways to permit multiple elaborations, and it's as though Bach is exploring from the initial note, the initial tonic of the key, all the ways out of that key into its neighbouring keys as he goes through the melodic ritual. But it involves melodic thinking of the highest order, an unbroken melisma that throws out spores around itself as it grows. In many ways, the history of melody since Bach has been a history of retraction, a steady concentration of the elements, as the melisma is curtailed to sonata-form themes, expanded again to the broad melodies of the Romantics, before being boiled down into motifs and melodic phrases in the modern world. Yet in all this we observe intense musical thinking, as composers strove to avoid banality, to make melodies and phrases which attract the sympathy and stir the heart. The great question for the critic of pop is whether pop involves any similar attempts at melodic invention. Now, Adorno attacked something that he called the regression of listening, which he believed had infected the entire musical culture of modern America. And however exaggerated his critique of the American songbook may strike us as being now, there is no doubt in my mind that this regression is exactly what we hear in the kind of pop that I've just been discussing. I'm not talking about the words, I'm talking about the musical experience, which has become truncated, embryonic, reduced to an external pulse, and often surrendered to the machine. It is surely right to speak of a new kind of listening, maybe a kind of listening that is not listening at all, when there is no melody to speak of, when the rhythm is machine-made, and when the only invitation to dance is an invitation to dance with oneself. And it is easier to imagine a kind of pop that is not like that. That is not like that pop, that is with the listener and not at him. And there's no need to go back to Elvis or the Beatles to find it. Now, it won't have escaped notice that in the examples I've given, harmonic progressions usually have little or nothing to do with the melodic line. And that's very obvious in the Ozzy Osbourne case, where the melody is carried by the harmony and has no life of its own, the harmony itself being a slushy sequence of triads. Not all pop is like this, of course. Sometimes there is real harmonic inventiveness, as in Led Zeppelin, Jimi Hendrix, and some instances of heavy metal. The purpose of my examples has not been to condemn pop music and pop culture outright, but to make comparisons. And the point of these comparisons is twofold. First, to persuade the pop fan that comparisons are possible, even within the world. Sorry, I've got a long way to this. I'm not on the end of that now. Comparisons are possible, even within the world of pop. Secondly, to show that comparison leads inevitably to judgment, and judgment in its turn, as Plato said, to a moral evaluation. To be non-judgmental is in fact already to make a kind of judgment. It is to suggest that it really doesn't matter what you listen to or dance to, and that there is no moral distinction between the various listening habits that have emerged in the age of mechanical reproduction. That is a morally charged position, and one that flies in the face of common sense. To suggest that people who live with a metric pulse as a constant background to their thoughts and movements are living in the same way, with the same kind of attention and the same pattern of challenges and rewards as others who know music only from sitting down to listen to it, clearing their minds meanwhile of all other thoughts, that suggestion is surely implausible. Likewise, to suggest that those who dance in the solipsistic way encouraged by metal or indie music share a form of life with those who dance when they dance in formation, with the spirit recorded so eloquently by Schiller, is to say something equally implausible. The difference is not merely in the kind of movements made, it is a difference in social valency and in the relative value placed on being with your neighbour rather than over and against him. If we go back for a moment to what I earlier said about rhythm and melody, we will recognise that whatever we wish to say about the moral character of music, it is bound up with the movement that we hear in music. This movement is a mark of life, and we respond to it by making sympathetic movements of our own, as when we dance with the music or sway along with it while listening. Movement in music arises internally to the musical line, and is there only insofar as it is heard there by the imaginative ear. But there is another kind of movement that we receive through music. Movement that is not in the music, but imposed upon it by an external pulse that has no intrinsic connection to the melodic line. Such a movement may be communicated through the music, but it arises externally in the beats and hums of a machine, in the pulse of an electronic device, in the shouting of a voice, or in the provocative sound of Alice in a state of self-disgusted arousal. As I suggested earlier, musical movement is addressed to our sympathies. It asks us to move with it. External movement is shoved at us. You cannot easily move with it, but you can submit to it. When music organised by this kind of external movement is played as a dance, it automatically atomizes the people on the dance floor. They may dance at each other, but only painfully with each other. And the dance is not something that you do, but something that happens to you, a pulse on which you are suspended like Alice on her wires. Only rational beings dance, and in the normal case they do so by way of putting their personality and their freedom on display in the manner described by Schiller. When you are in the grip of an external and mechanized rhythm, your freedom is partly overridden, and it is hard then to move in a way that suggests a personal relation to a partner. The I-thou relation is eclipsed by an I-id relation. Plato was surely right, therefore, to think that when we move in time to music, we are educating our characters. We are learning an aspect of our embodiment as free beings. Embodiment can have virtuous and vicious forms. To take just one example, there is a deep distinction in the matter of sexual presentation between modesty and lewdness, and an awful lot of things in between the two. Modesty makes room for the other as someone whom you are with. Lewdness is at the other, but not with him or her, since it is an attempt to cancel the other's freedom to withdraw. And it is very clear that these traits of character are displayed in dancing. Plato's thought was that if you display lewdness in the dances that you most enjoy, then you are that much nearer to acquiring the habit. To put it in the language that I have been using, you are learning to be at, not with, the people whom you meet. Now, dancing is not just moving, nor is it moving in response to a sound or a beat or whatever. Animals can do that, and you can train horses and elephants to move in time to a beat in the circus arena with an effect that looks like dancing, in fact rather more like dancing than what you will see in most hunt balls. But they are not dancing any more than birds are singing. To dance is, in its true social form, to move with something, conscious that this is what you are doing. You move with the music, and also, in old-fashioned dances, with your partner. This moving with is something that animals cannot do, since it involves a deliberate imitation of life radiating from another source than your own body. That in turn demands a conception of self and other, and of the relation between them, a conception which I would argue is unavailable outside the context provided by language use and first-person awareness. Now, I've argued that there are discriminations to be made within popular music, and that they concern those very dimensions of musical significance, rhythm, melody and harmony, which make music in all its forms so important, a mirror of human life. There is plenty of tuneful popular music. I didn't have time to play it, but there is plenty there, and plenty of music with which one can sing along and to which one can dance in sociable ways. Yet there is growing within popular music another kind of practice altogether, one in which the movement is no longer contained in the musical line, but exported to a place outside it, to a centre of pulsation which demands not that you listen, but that you submit. If you do submit, the moral qualities of the music vanish behind the excitement. If you listen, however, and listen critically, as I have been suggesting, you will discern those moral qualities, which are as vivid as the nobility in Elgar's Second Symphony or the horror in Schoenberg's Erwartung. And then you might be tempted to agree with Plato that if this music is permitted, then the laws that govern us will change.